Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Dick Blumenthal has been making our community tick for at least the last 40 years, currently as U.S. Senator. He's joining us today from Washington, D.C., where he has just returned from a trip to the hot spot in the globe right now, Kiev in Ukraine. Blumenthal, thank you so much, Senator, for coming on the air.
Thank you so much, Paul. Good to be back, and especially good to be with you. We've known each other most of those decades. And
That's right. Starting with U.S. Attorney right down the street from our office. So, Senator Blumenthal, you're one of 7 senators, including Connecticut's other Senator Chris Murphy, a bipartisan group who were meeting with the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, about the threat of an imminent invasion of his country by Russia. Senator Blumenthal, how was President Zelensky doing? What was it like to be in the room with him?
Really inspiring, Paul, because here's a country very modest in size compared to many European countries, very small compared to Russia, which has already invaded it. It took Crimea. It has surrogates in Donbass, the eastern part of the state, now has amassed more than 100,000 troops on its borders, as close as Belarus, which is a few hours away by car from the capital, Kyiv, where we were meeting with President Zelensky. And for the last 8 years, the people of Ukraine have been fighting the Russians with great cost in lives and resources. President Zelensky was very resolute and resilient, determined, courageous, and appreciative that we came as a bipartisan group. We were 3 Republicans, 4 Democrats from North and South, Midwest, to say the American people are going to stand with you and with the people of Ukraine. And I think that Vladimir Putin has underestimated the resolve of the people of Ukraine, as came across to us, not only from President Zelensky, but from the foreign minister, the interior minister, the defense minister, and the Ukrainian people.
Was it accurate to say your mission was just to let them know and to let the world know that the United States fights about just about everything else politically in DC, but there's a bipartisan consensus that we are going to try to have their back to some extent?
Exactly. And we were emboldened, I'll tell you very personally, by the Ukrainian community of Connecticut. Mm-hmm. I've spoken to many of them in New Haven, Hartford, and Stamford, who are obviously very passionately for their family and friends who are there. And one more point, we were there not only to express our unity in supporting the people of Ukraine in defending themselves, no American troops, but also to learn what additional arms or financial support they need, what we can do to help deter Vladimir Putin. For example, beginning strong economic sanctions sooner rather than later, before any invasion, providing more arms. I think there has to be a major arms lift of lethal weapons to Ukraine. I've said it for years that we need to up our game in that way. And that kind of fact-finding is also a purpose of the trip.
How long did you meet with the president? Were you in his office?
I think it was probably close to an hour in his office. By the way, the security going into his office was every bit as rigorous, maybe more so, as going into the White House, the Oval Office, to meet with the President of the United States. But we also met with the foreign minister for at least that amount of time, and others in the government who have responsibility.
Dick, I know that the presence of 7 bipartisan senators in and of itself is a message. So your presence there obviously mattered. Were you surprised by anything you learned specifically? Did he tell you something? Did you see something you didn't know before going?
Interestingly, one of the issues we discussed with President Zelensky was the prosecution of a former president.
Who's there right now? Who returned?
Poroshenko, who returned while we were there, and his followers, a couple of thousand of them, were demonstrating in support of Poroshenko against the prosecution of him by the Zelensky administration. I know it's convoluted, but the bottom line is that President Zelensky was very, very passionate on the issue of the rule of law and prosecution of corrupt officials. I'm not taking a stand, I personally, Richard Blumenthal, on whether Poroshenko should be prosecuted, whether he's guilty of corruption charges, but there were kind of a deja vu feeling or a feeling of parallels around the globe where corrupt officials should be held accountable if in fact the charges are valid. And so it was interesting and maybe surprising that there was this return by Poroshenko while
Senator Blumenthal, of course, those of us who aren't like you in the middle of it and knowing anything, watch it from a distance and think there's always a chess game going on with Vladimir Putin. So Poroshenko is not a supporter of Putin's publicly. In fact, he has criticized President Zelensky for not being tough enough with Russia. However, from this distance and not having your inside information, I couldn't help but wonder, sometimes the enemy of my enemy is thy friend. Did Putin have some role in getting Poroshenko to come back to Ukraine right when a possible invasion is brewing to distract Zelensky so he sort of has a war on two fronts?
That's a really central and critically important question, Paul, because Vladimir Putin's playbook here is to divide and destabilize Western democracy. We saw it in 2016 in the United States with misinformation. We've seen it in UK and in France, and especially in the Eastern European countries that once were part of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin would like to restore his hegemony in that part of the world, restore the former Soviet Union. And essentially, Poroshenko's presence and prosecution could divide the Ukrainian people. But at the same time, you're also very correct in your observation that Poroshenko has also been very much against Russia. And that, I think, is the central point that I would make, that Poroshenko and Zelensky, while they may be arch enemies, signify and reflect that the Ukrainian people are very determined and committed to uphold their independence and freedom. Vladimir Putin, in the back of his mind, or maybe in the forefront, I think, expects he'll be hailed as a liberator if he invades. Now, maybe that was true in some fringe areas in the eastern part of Ukraine that are bordering Russia, but the Ukrainian people are absolutely determined, resilient, resolute, and that's a message I took away from our visit.
Okay, we're talking to U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal, Connecticut, who's just back from a visit to Ukraine, where the whole world is watching to see if Russia is going to invade. Now, talking about U.S. interests, you talk about Putin's designs on trying to maybe cobble together parts of the Soviet Union, maintain a sphere of influence, keep Ukraine out of NATO. Some experts have said it's really about his declining popularity at home and trying to, because he has overwhelming support domestically through misinformation if he were to invade. What is the U.S. interest here? In what sense is this a replay of the Cold War, where, because Russia has threatened in recent days to put missiles back in Cuba, put them in Venezuela. We know they can mess our computer system. What is at stake for us here, and how will this play out if there's an invasion for us?
Another key question, and let me just say at the outset, the students of history among us know that wars often result from miscalculation. In fact, more commonly than not, look at World War I, look at some of the other conflagrations that have occurred, the Cuban Missile Crisis, talk about possible nuclear arms in Mexico or Cuba, as Putin has mentioned, almost resulted in war. So the danger of miscalculation here is that Putin underestimates our resolve and the cost to himself. Not only economically, obviously we can impose export controls, we can impose crippling economic sanctions of other kinds, like disconnecting Russia from the SWIFT financial system. We should be providing arms to the Ukrainians so they can marshal an insurgent effort, much as happened in Afghanistan, different countries, same principle. But there are dangers here to us if there is an invasion, as to what the ripple effect will be if the conflict expands. And so we have a very strong interest in deterring Vladimir Putin from invading this country. The conventional wisdom is that the ground has to harden, literally freeze, for him to send his tanks rumbling across the border into Ukraine. Remember, those military exercises he's planning for early February are in Belarus, which is just several hours away from Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, by car. So he could encircle Kyiv, he could send bombers over, and the Ukrainians would be badly outmatched. And there is then the humanitarian crisis that would occur, literally bloodshed, innocent civilians being killed, another grave consequence to us.
Senator Blumenthal, the conventional wisdom has been that while we can impose economic sanctions, Russia has a lot of workarounds because of its controls over natural resources that it sells to other countries, and that we can't stop an invasion, but as you said, we can arm an insurgency that would be prolonged and definitely have losses from Russia. You said Putin shouldn't miscalculate our resolve. What do you think? What are your signals that you're picking up that he's believing about our ability to stop him or inflict dangerous consequences?
First, he knows, and he's right on this fact, we're not sending United States troops into Ukraine. US troops are off the table. So when I talk about providing arms, it is so the Ukrainians can defend themselves. But the miscalculation would be that the Ukrainians will hail him as a liberator, or that they will resist. And the resistance could be extremely costly to Vladimir Putin. When they begin sending, I hate to be blunt about it, but the body bags back to Moscow, he will face an internal crisis when economic sanctions grip his economy and undercut it. It will hit Russians. Now, he doesn't really care about the average Russian. He's an autocrat and a dictator. He doesn't have to care. But if the Germans will make explicit and clear that they are stopping the flow of natural gas through Nord Stream 2, that will hit him where it hurts. And the Germans can help deter him. So
do you think the Germans would do that?
I think they would. That's my personal view, that they would stop it. Whether they will make it clear and explicit beforehand is a critical question, because it will help deter them. But let me use that word again and again and again. Deter, deter, deter. We don't want this conflict. It should deter them. And just one last point. Why should Americans be concerned? Well, Vladimir Putin has made it clear that his playbook, dividing, demoralizing, degrading Western democracies, apply not just to Ukraine, but to all democracy. He believes that his system will prevail only if he can divide us, divide Americans from each other, divide the allies, keep America estranged from Europe if he can do it. He obviously did it under Trump. So it's not a vainglorious kind of hope on his part. But I think we need to be unified, as we were in this delegation.
Okay, two last questions before I let you go back to vote on voting rights. And thank you, Senator Blumenthal, I know it's a busy day. Harry asks, did Afghanistan weak us to the point of our lifting the sanctions on that pipeline? Did that have any impact on our ability to make him believe there are going to be severe economic consequences?
Sanctions always have consequences. We need to begin imposing those sanctions before he invades, so he knows that we're serious about it. And I believe that the Menendez bill makes clear what our view will be on sanctions. I'm a leading co-sponsor of the Menendez bill, and I hope it'll come to a vote quickly.
And my very last question, and thank you again for making the time. How does this fit into our new view of international relations post-Cold War and post-Cold War, post the period after the break of the Soviet Union? Are we seeing a reassembling of the Cold War dynamic between us and Russia? President Biden wanting us to pivot to China. Does this mean that's not going to happen? Are we in a new Cold War, or how are we going to be pursuing our interests, and how much are we going to intervene?
Not a new Cold War. You know the old saying, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes.
Mhm.
And what we're seeing in a way is a rhyme of big powers confronting each other in competition, trying to work out ways they can compete peacefully, economically. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I see Russia trying to catch us, for example, in our predominance on undersea warfare. We have the best submarines due to electric boat and the great workers in Groton, southeastern Connecticut, and the supply chain in Connecticut generally. We are strong. But just one example, militarily, Russia and China are both strong competitors, but also economically, we're seeing that competition. But I would say that we've learned from the Cold War that existential threats, that is, nuclear threats, really should be avoided at any possible cost because they tend to escalate very quickly. And so I would not expect the Cold War to repeat or rhyme in the sense that we are at each other's throats with nuclear threats. At least I hope so. And I hope we can find a way to resolve our differences on Ukraine and that Putin will be deterred from rash and reckless action in an invasion with the human consequences that would be so abhorrent.
All right, Senator Richard Blumenthal, thank you for representing the people of Connecticut in Kiev with the president of Ukraine. Thanks for being on top of these big questions, and thank you for making time. I'm on to Dateline New Haven at WNHH-FM.
Thanks so much, Paul. Good to be with you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
And we're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience playing I Wish I Knew How It'd Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.